I'm Mr. eTutor, your Mr. eTutor here at MrEtutor.com, and welcome to video module 11-3. In this module, we'll be discussing how you get around the fact that there's very limited practice material for any SAT subject test that you might want to take. You know, if we're trying to get ready for the SAT 1, we have all kinds of practice questions available to us because the College Board's official SAT study guide already contains 8 tests and some extra practice questions. And there's also the online service provided by the College Board. And finally, if you know the right people in this world, you can usually hook yourself up with some PDFs of previously administered SAT 1 tests. Unfortunately, this is not the case when it comes to the subject tests. For most of the subject tests, there is only one complete practice test available in circulation. And for the history and math subject tests, there are only 2 complete practice tests available and in circulation. Now this, by the way, is one extra reason why I strongly recommend you consider taking a history or a math test, because if you take those tests, you've automatically doubled the amount of practice material that you can work with. Still, I recognize it's only 2 tests, but it's, again, twice as much as 1 test. So it's not a bad decision to make from a strategic standpoint at all. So we're going to need to come up with some intelligent way to prepare for these tests without, first of all, exhausting the questions too quickly. And second of all, we're also going to need to come up with some way that we can reuse the material even after you've taken the practice test. You should also be aware that the College Board publishes a free PDF document that contains a set of sample questions for each of the individual subject tests. I recommend you go download this document as quickly as you can and use it to do your initial practice with. You're going to want to try to do those questions right off the bat, see how well you can handle them, and try doing the questions for any subject that you might be interested in taking the test for. So, for instance, if you're a Spanish student and you don't consider yourself to be a particularly good Spanish student, go ahead and take the Spanish subject questions anyway. See how you do on them. You might surprise yourself. On the other hand, if you don't surprise yourself, well, at least you've confirmed that the Spanish test is probably not the one for you. After you've done that with the various subjects that you might be interested in taking the test with, go back and, of course, score your questions, see how well you did. But that's not all, of course. We're going to use those questions that you just did to sort of prepare ourselves for the next round, which is going to be taking the real test from the College Board study guide. So look over each question carefully. And when you look over the questions, don't just think about what the question is actually asking you. Think about the underlying concepts that surround that question and make sure that you're familiar with those concepts. For instance, if you're looking at a biology question that asks you something about anaphase, you're going to want to review meiosis and mitosis and make sure that you have those processes roughly at your fingertips. But for any of the subject tests that you take, it's not important usually to get too detailed with the amount of knowledge that you try to acquire. Instead, you want to have command of the broad strokes. But you're going to want to have command of a lot of broad strokes for each subject. So remember, when you're working with this PDF and the dozen or so questions per subject that you find there, the breadth of your knowledge is far more important than the depth of your knowledge within a particular subject. Make sure you understand the surrounding concepts for each question that you look at, and don't sweat it too much if you're not totally clear on the details. Once you've done that, you'll be ready to take a complete practice test from the College Board Subject Test Study Guide. Take that under real testing conditions, and then go back and score yourself and see what your final score would have been for that subject test. Don't be too discouraged by that, though, of course, because that's not your real score. We can always improve it. Once you've scored the test, you're going to go back through every single question of the test and repeat the process that we just did with the free PDF. So, for instance, if you're working on the American History subject test and you happen to see a question about Martin Luther King, you're going to want to make sure you know not just who Martin Luther King was, but also about the whole civil rights movement and slavery and all those types of related issues. Again, the breadth is what's important. You want to make sure that for every single concept that you look at within those questions, 2 or 3 or 4 related concepts pop into your mind automatically. That's the kind of knowledge and understanding that you're going for. If you work with these strategies and do your best to understand every question and every answer choice on the subject tests that you're preparing for, you'll find that you acquire more than enough information to be able to do well on test day. And this kind of leads us to another strategic question. Remember, when we talked about how to take apart the SAT 1, and now that we're talking about how to take apart these subject tests, it's always important to come back to the idea of what the College Board is thinking and why they do what they do. Now, you and I both know that the College Board likes your money. And we both know that they make money whenever somebody buys one of their books. So if that's the case, and if it's also the case that students everywhere are clamoring to get their hands on more subject tests so they can do more preparation, we need to ask ourselves, why is it that the College Board has not come out with a whole book of tests for each individual subject test? Of course, I can't presume to know the answer, but I have a pretty good guess. I think that the College Board realizes that if it made available several copies of each individual subject test for students to prepare with, students would realize too quickly that the tests are pretty much the same no matter when you take them. In other words, the same basic concepts come up on each American history test, the same basic concepts come up on each biology test, or each chemistry, or each Chinese, or whatever test it is you're going to take. You're going to see the same basic concepts come up over and over again. Now, the College Board counts on you thinking of these subject tests as though they actually tested your knowledge of the subject matter. And if it became too obvious that they don't actually do that, well, the College Board loses a little bit of its edge in the whole game. This all comes back to the standardization game that the College Board has to keep playing. They want you to think that the subject tests can be different from one another, and that in order to do well on, let's say, the world history test, you actually have to know a whole bunch of things about world history. They want you to think that because that makes the test harder for you, and it makes the scores more reliable for them. But remember, these are not really subject tests, no matter what you call them. They are really standardized tests that happen to be about particular areas of knowledge. So the questions that come up on one test need to be pretty similar to the questions that come up on every other test. If it were not the case, then of course the scores could not be compared reliably, as we discussed in the modules explaining how the SAT-1 is put together. For example, if you took the American history test in December and saw that every single question on the test was about the American Revolution, and then your friend took the same test in February and saw that every single question on his test was about the Civil War, well, the results from those tests could not be compared in a meaningful way. Colleges know this, and the College Board knows this. And this is why every test contains pretty much the same makeup of pretty much the same material. So even though it might be frustrating that there's only 1 or 2 practice tests available for any subject test you might be interested in a way it's actually better, because the limited number of available tests probably indicates that the College Board realizes that every single test is pretty much the same as every single other test within the same subject. So really, we only need to work with 1 or 2 practice tests to be able to get all of the information that we're going to need to take the test for real. Thanks very much for watching, and remember, it's easier than you think.